Today, let's make a dishcloth that uses garter stitch and the bulky knitting machine. This makes not only a good dishcloth, but a good practice piece for two different ways of working machine knitting garter stitch. This written pattern is found on page 66 of my Mostly Classic Cables book. It's the cloth on the bottom of the stack. I've changed it very slightly for this video. Here's the cover of the Mostly Classic Cables book with the dishcloth marked with an arrow. The book is all about getting classic hand-knitted cable looks on all kinds of knitting machines. The dishcloth is one of the building block patterns where we learn to make textured stitches. In addition to a multitude of patterns, the book contains a cable encyclopedia for machine knitters. I will put a link to where it is sold on my website in the program notes in case this sort of thing interests you. But onto the pattern at hand. We will be working on my Knit Smart machine. A Knit Smart is very, very much like a Bond, almost identical. I'm choosing it for the project to show that this technique may be used on the very simplest machine, and this is the simplest one I own. But be clear, you can use the design on any bulky machine. Brother, Singer, Toyota, plastic bed, or metal bed, it doesn't make any difference, and you need no bells and whistles. I will try to give instructions for all as we go along. Use a worsted weight cotton yarn. I'm using 0.75 weight softball cotton. This is normally quite an expensive cotton yarn, but I get it at a real bargain from countryknittingofmaine.com, and I think they have a good supply. Let's start with the chain stitch cast on. I have already begun in waste yarn and knitted in a ravel cord. If you do not know how to do that, it is covered in my other videos on the Knit Smart, and I will place a link to that playlist in the program notes. Now we start by knotting a loop into the main yarn and loosely chain stitching through the loop the first time and then through each successive stitch around the needle shanks. It does take a little bit of practice to get your stitches both even and loose enough that the machine can knit through them, but this is a dishcloth, so it makes a good practice project. This yarn has a little bit of a bumpy texture, which adds a little bit of a challenge over what it would be to cast on a smooth yarn. But it's not really very hard, just work slowly and patiently. When you get to the end of the needle span, hang the loop that is on your tool on the final needle. Cast on 25 stitches. If I were working on a metal machine, I would bring the needles all the way forward just like this and set the machine on N and allow it to knit back from hold. This simple machine finds that a little bit challenging in this yarn, so I simply make the first row as a manually knitted row. Lay the yarn in each needle hook successively, pull back, and form a stitch manually. This is a nifty trick to use anytime you're doing something that's very challenging for the machine. If your carriage was on the right, it now needs to be moved to the left. Removing the key plate on a Knit Smart or Bond means that the carriage can be moved across without knitting or dropping stitches. So that's what I did. On a Studio, you can simply lift the top of the carriage and get a free pass. On a Brother, depressing both part buttons allows a free pass. The point is, we want the carriage on the side where the working yarn is. Knit Smart machines try key plate 40, Bonds try key plate 4, other machines try stitch size 8 to 10 on the dial. We want this fabric to come out pretty loose and open for two reasons. First of all, it is going to shrink and loft and draw in a great deal once it's washed. And second, I find that a somewhat loosely knitted dishcloth does a better job of scrubbing and also dries faster than a densely knitted one. Now knit 2 rows. Here begins the first garter stitch technique. I'm going to use one steel circular knitting needle. It doesn't have to be steel like mine, but it does have to be slender like mine. This is used to remove all the stitches and then turn the work. You could also use a garter bar if you had one, or knit a few rows of waste yarn to get the same effect. Using the needle, I must insert from the same direction into each stitch in succession all the way across the work. When it becomes difficult to poke the needle into a stitch, I can pull it through so that I can free the head of it, the stiff spot, and let the stitches that are already threaded stay on the cable. Choose a needle long enough that it crosses the work easily with enough left over to hang the stiff part of the needle down on each end to make this process possible. Once all the stitches are on the needle, I can drop the work off of the machine. Remove the weights from the fabric after it's off the machine. Turn the work, move the carriage to the other side, and rehang so that where we were looking at the purl side of the fabric, as always when we knit, we are now looking at the knit side of the fabric. Now pick up each stitch in order and hang them back on 25 needles. Be careful not to insert the tool the way I'm showing you now under the wire. That's going to be much more difficult to work with than making sure that the stitches are hanging directly on your tool as you're seeing now. It'll be easier both to hang and also to remove the circular needle. Just make sure you don't get them under the cord. If you were using waste yarn instead of a circular needle, the process would be very similar. We would be picking up the main yarn stitches and just using the waste yarn as a tool. Using a garter bar looks and feels different, though it accomplishes the same thing, and I do have another whole video on that. If you find 3 stitches at once hard to grab, use the single prong tool and do one at a time. Garter stitch is the result of knit stitches alternating with purl stitches on successive rows. Since the machine only basically makes knit stitches, we can get that to happen by turning the knitting to and fro as we have done. The machine will still make the same kind of stitches, but since the row below it was facing the other way, the effect is knits and purls. If you used a circular needle, pull it out now. It's slim and slippery, so it's quite simple. Be sure to hang your comb and weights back on the machine in whatever way was working for you. If you are using a bond hem or a cast-on rag, removing and replacing the weights can be done simply by taking the steel rods in and out. Sure the carriage is on the same side as the working yarn. Knit 2 more rows, then turn the work again and rehang on the same needles just as we did before. Now you can clearly see what has happened. We were looking at the purl side of the fabric as usual, but now there are 2 rows where we're looking at the knit side of the fabric because we turned it. Each time the fabric is turned by whatever method, we'll need to move the carriage to the opposite side to catch up with the tail of the working yarn. So let's review. Here is the chain stitch cast on. Here are the first 2 rows we knitted. Then we turned the work, and here are the 2 rows we knitted then. They face the opposite direction. The opposite of a knit stitch is a purl stitch, and that's what we see in this ridge, purl stitches. We turned the work again, and now we're ready to knit these rows. We have not done so yet. There is, in fact, one additional row. Remember the one that we hand knitted after casting on? For a lot of simple projects, and for this one, that row is really just part of the setup and need not be considered as part of the pattern. The pattern thus far then, reading from bottom to top so we can go where the cast on is cast on, knit 2 rows, turn, knit 2 rows, turn. Now knit 2 more rows and we'll begin the second style of garter stitch. This one is done by reforming stitches 2, 3, and 4 from the edge of each edge every other row. On both sides, the very edge stitch that I pointed to a moment ago, that is going to stay as is. So we have one complete knitted column, knit stitch column, up the outer edge of each side. This is not absolutely essential, but it makes a neater edge, and it also involves a little bit less reforming of stitches. Do this on both sides. Wherever the yarn tail is for this couple of rows, as we work and reform, it may tend to grow. So be sure that you tighten it up to a normal stitch size before resuming the knitting. The easiest way to reform one row of stitches is to stick your tool in the row below the one that's presently on the needles. Then drop the stitch off the needle, give a tug down. That will free the stitch that was last made, and you can latch it back up. Working in the ordinary easy to latch direction will create a purl stitch. When all stitches are settled back on needles and the yarn tail is tightened up and perhaps the claw weight hung back if you needed to remove it, knit 2 rows and repeat this process. Do this 16 times for 32 rows. That will yield a cloth that is roughly 6 inches by 6 inches at the usual gauge this yarn achieves. That's after washing and drying a couple of times. It will be bigger coming right off of the machine. Of course, it's perfectly okay to alter row count to personal taste, either to change size or because your row gauge is not quite the same. For the sample I'm showing you, I actually only did 11 repeats, not 16. After the final repeat of the 2-row sequence, knit 1 more row across, and now we return to the first stitch pattern. We're going to remove all the stitches on whatever tool we're going to use to turn the work, turn it. Then we'll knit another 2 rows and turn the work again. Always remember when turning that the carriage must be moved to the opposite side from where it lands in order to catch up with where the working yarn tail is. And always remember to rehang your comb and weights or whatever you're using to keep the fabric under control. I forgot that here. Had a couple failed stitches and had to fix them by hand. So to review, knit 1 row after the final repeat where we've been working garter stitch along the edge. Turn the fabric, knit 2 more rows, turn the fabric again, knit a final 2 rows, and bind off. I'm binding off using the transfer method here. If you're not comfortable binding off on the side or from the side that your carriage ends up on, feel free to knit an additional row to get to your comfortable spot. Just as at the beginning, it will make so little difference as to be not worrisome. I'm using the transfer bind off here because it makes a chain stitch that matches the chain stitch cast on. Move 1 stitch over to the next needle, starting at the edge with the working yarn. Manually create a stitch where both of those stitches knit off. Move the new stitch to the next needle and proceed in that manner across the work. If you need more help with this bind off, I do have whole videos on the subject. When the final stitch has been transferred and knitted off, snip the yarn tail and pull it through that last stitch. Now separate the waste yarn from the main yarn. I used a ravel cord so I can just pull it out, and we'll have a finished beginning and ending edge. Both are chain stitched so they match very well. Weave in the yarn tails and the cloth is complete. Plain stockinette, which is all knit stitches, rolls at the edges. This does not, because garter stitch alternates knit and purl stitches and stops that rolling. If you've enjoyed creating garter stitch on your knitting machine, you may enjoy the other textured stitches that are presented in my cables playlist. The playlist was created as support for the Mostly Classic Cables book and the people who want to knit from it. It includes textural stitches because we so often use them along with cables to create the total hand-knitted Aran effect. I will put a link to the cables playlist in the program notes in case that's something you want to check out.